Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody who's with us here in person as well as online for what I am sure is going to be a really, really interesting conversation with Jeremy Eichler, the classical music critic of the Boston Globe. Jeremy's written an extraordinarily interesting book called Time's Echo, the Second World War, the Holocaust, and the Music of Remembrance. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Larry Bacow. Until relatively recently, June 30th, I was the president of Harvard. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation with Jeremy. In the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you all that while I enjoy classical music, I do not consider myself to be an expert. But also the topic that we're going to discuss is personal to me in an important way. We're going to talk in part about the Holocaust and how we remember it, and the meaning of the Holocaust, and how that's expressed in music. My mother was a survivor of Auschwitz, so for me this has special meaning, especially when we talk about memory. So, Jeremy, thanks for being with us. This book, which you should all buy, send this year for birthday presents, for holiday presents, is really an extraordinary work. Since many people, book just came out recently, have not had a chance to read it. I thought it might make sense, Jeremy, just to take a minute or two and try and give people a sense of the flavor of the book and what it's really all about.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much, Larry, for being open to having this conversation. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to talk about this work with you. Especially given your own personal connections to the era that the book discusses. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Time's Echo is a book about how culture bears witness to history and how we might think about reimagining the power and presence of art in our lives today. It explores those ideas through a tapestry of stories drawn from the lives of four iconic classical composers from the 20th century: Arnold Schoenberg, Richard Strauss, Dmitri Shostakovich, and Benjamin Britten. It traces their path during the darkest years of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and then it tells the story of the extraordinary musical memorials that they each created after the war. And it's all by way of trying to think a little bit more deeply and invite the reader to join me in thinking more deeply about art as a bridge to the past, something that can sort of deepen our understanding, enhance our sense of empathy, and really make more palpable our sense of felt contact with these earlier eras, not just the wartime, but also some of the earlier eras that preceded it. In a nutshell, that's what the book is about.
Thank you. So the book is about memory and music as memory. But music also, in certain contexts, creates history by itself, by certain performances that turn out to be memorable, that inspire in various ways. In reading the book, there was one that really, really jumped out at me and stayed with me. And that is the performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in Leningrad. And I thought it might be interesting to start the conversation just by focusing on that. So tell the story, because it's an amazing story.
This is really an extraordinary story. The question is about the Leningrad premiere of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, which was written during the Second World War, started while Shostakovich was actually in the city of Leningrad during the siege, that famous 900 day, kind of encircling by the Nazi armies of the city of Leningrad. There was sort of starvation rampant in the city. There were dogs and cats that disappeared from all the streets. It was really a very, very dark time. And Shostakovich, sort of in a great act of patriotism, wrote this work that was supposed to be a kind of rousing defense of the Soviet spirit in its great hour of need. He finished the work outside of Leningrad, where he was eventually evacuated with his family. But when it was time to premiere the work, first it happened in other cities, but then eventually they said, we have to do a performance in the besieged city of Leningrad itself. And so it's this really dramatic story. They flew the score in under cover of darkness. They tried to summon what was left of the radio symphony. I think at the very first rehearsal, there were maybe 10 or 12 people who showed up because none of the rest were still alive or available.
And the horn player wasn't even strong enough to play because he had been starved.
Yes, there's a story about at that first run through, the conductor kind of looking over to cue the first trumpet, and there was no one there and there was no sound. And upon closer inspection, the man had fallen to his knees and explained that he was feeling too weak to play. So it's kind of making music in the most unimaginable conditions. They ended up having to call musically capable soldiers back from the front. They rehearsed this thing over the weeks and months, and then it came to the actual day of the premiere. This part is amazing to me. To guarantee a kind of quiet for the premiere to take place, they anticipatorily bombarded the Nazi troop positions. And then in the sort of ultimate gesture of kind of sonic psychological warfare, they angled loudspeakers towards the troop encampments of the Nazis around the city, essentially trying to project the sound of their own defiance as represented by this music. And the premiere was incredibly successful and went on to be this iconic moment in music history, an iconic moment in Soviet history. And this last piece of it that always struck me, there were German soldiers who were camped outside the city, who years later went and found the conductor. They ended up in East Germany. They went and found the conductor of the Leningrad premiere of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony and explained, we were Germans, we were outside the city. We heard this music coming to us. And we realized that music of this strength and power coming from a starving city, we knew at that very moment that we would not and could not win this war. So it doesn't get much more dramatic than that as historic premieres go.
So I mean, again, the book is about music as memory, but as I say, music also creates history in itself, creates memories for others in the future. I was hoping you could sort of contrast that a little bit and put it in a more contemporary context. I'm a child of the 60s, early 70s. I know there's some other people in the audience. I have some high school classmates here. When we were growing up at that time, there was a lot of music that was protest music that came out of the civil rights movement, that came out of the Vietnam War. If you think of Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, for example, This Land Is Your Land, This Man Is My Land. Joan Baez and Pete Seeger, their iconic performances, of We Shall Overcome. I can't listen to Blowin' in the Wind, Bob Dylan's famous song, without thinking back to those times and what it actually meant. And those were songs that are iconic today, but they also, in their own way, they told a story. But even more importantly, they inspired people, inspired them to continue the fight for civil rights, to oppose the Vietnam War, to take action. If Jeremy Eichler were to rewrite this book, but not to focus on the four composers that you did, but to think about the music of that time, does music play a similar or a different role, both in capturing memory and then preserving it over time?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I think that, of course, it's both similar and different. All of the different music you just mentioned and referred to, from your generation, of course, that many of us remember. Those are all incredibly memorable artists, memorable songs, and memorable moment in the history of music of our times. One of the big kind of turn that the book makes is to say that it's not just we who remember music, but music that also remembers us. That music listens to human society, that it reflects and crystallizes these wordless truths from these earlier eras, and kind of records a record. The critic Adorno called it an unconscious chronicle for a world that has outlived its own demise. He was writing after the Holocaust when he said that. And so in that sense, I think that lens could very much be applied to all kinds of music and sort of looking for the reflections of the society that created it. And on the other hand, it is different in the sense that one of the other stories that the book also tries to tell is really the story of the Enlightenment and the European Enlightenment and this kind of these greatest dreams and hopes of many thinkers and of humanity, let's say, across the 19th century. You can think of the final chorus in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, that setting of the Ode to Joy by Schiller, and there's this kind of vision for a time when all humans will be equal and living with dignity and freedom. And so that was kind of the high hopes that were voiced through art and through music of that era. And so I wanted to write about what happened when that vision for what humanity could be, what happened when what got carried into the 20th century, into the darkness of the Second World War, into an event that, as one philosopher said, describing the Holocaust, an event that ruptured the layer of solidarity among all who wear a human face. So I wanted to kind of record that disjunction and think about how art carries forward that memory. So in order, of course, to write about those specific events, that time in history, and in order to find composers who carried that vision forward, that's how I arrived at these generations of composers and these particular four.
So that's a good explanation of why these four composers and why the works that they did. But I'm also curious about why focus on the Holocaust itself, right? One could have written about other composers capturing other moments in time. Personal interest in that? I mean, what leads to using music as a way of helping to revive memory of that experience?
Yeah, I think I was keenly aware of, as we were talking about, this extraordinary nature of that rupture that the Holocaust represented. I was also aware of being part of a kind of transitional generation that grew up with the presence of many survivors, around us, and aware that my own children will be growing up in a world where, in the coming decades, that living memory will be completely gone. And so this sense that this was the time, in a way, to write about art's ability to remember and to work as a bridge, sort of precisely at this moment. It also struck me, while I was training as a historian, it struck me that there were all of these books out there about the architecture of memory, the cinema of memory, the poetry of memory, but it was really hard to find a book that was, thoughtfully done about the music of memory. And this seemed to me like the strangest kind of absence, because if you think about it, music has such a visceral quality. And at one point I thought, does the world really need another book about the era of the Second World War and the Holocaust? This is pretty well-tread terrain. But what I ended up thinking was that actually what the kinds of contact, the nature of the contact that music opens up or makes possible with these earlier eras, and with this era in particular, really is unique, and that we can have so much information about the past through archives, through monographs, through the endless scroll of Wikipedia. All that information is there, but there is a really deep and fundamental difference between information and knowledge. And it was that knowledge, that sense of a more tangible felt contact with these earlier eras that I felt was absolutely on the wane generationally and in our culture at large. And that music really, for me, was the most powerful way to think about reclaiming it.
Have you talked to survivors, because we still have some around, about the way in which they experience this music and the emotion that it might stimulate amongst them?
Absolutely. One of the real privileges of doing the book was having the chance to have some conversations, one with Shostakovich's widow, who is still alive and who was there for the premiere of the Babi Yar Symphony, an extraordinary work whose story I tell in the book. She was not a survivor, but she certainly survived that very difficult era of history. I also spoke with the cellist Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who has an extraordinary story. She's in her 90s, and she is, I believe, the last living member of the women's orchestra that was convened and performed within the camp of Auschwitz. And to hear her memories, to learn from her directly about music's role in that place at that time, and then her own relationship to it in the subsequent years, during which she actually collaborated with Benjamin Britten in one of many really beautiful synchronicities the book also tracks. That was a wonderful honor and a privilege. But Larry, let me ask you, your own mother was a survivor of Auschwitz. Maybe if you'd care to share a little bit. I know there are certainly many people here in this room and online, no doubt, who have not heard her story, and if you'd care to share any aspects of it, and how it, we talk about this sort of memory being perpetuated through, in my case, cultural memory through works of art. It's also clearly through personal life choices, and from what I understand, her memory has also, in very concrete ways, influenced your own personal path.
So, where to start? My mother grew up in a small farming village outside of Frankfurt, a town of about 900 people. Jews had lived there for centuries, about 15, 16 Jewish families. When Hitler came to power after Kristallnacht, things got very difficult, as they did for all Jews in town. On September 14th, 1942, 80 years ago last week, all of the Jews of Lundorf and the 6 surrounding towns were transported on the same day to Theresienstadt, another concentration camp. There were 120 approximately who were transported on that day. We only have approximate numbers. My mother was the only one who came back. So, she was 15 when she went into the camps, and 18 when she got out. So growing up, it was, my mother didn't talk about it very much, which is similar to, I think, many Holocaust survivors. She had a heart attack when she was in her late 40s, and then felt compelled to talk more about the experience. I always knew about it, knew why we didn't have any cousins or anything else, or relatives on my mother's side. And then I started learning a lot more about her experience. And I think actually it was only later in life when I really learned details that it started to affect me far more than it had sort of shaped my existence growing up. There are 2 ways, I would say, in which it's affected what I do and what I've done. When I was asked to be the president of Harvard, initially I was quite reluctant. It was a conversation. And then Charlottesville occurred. And for those of you who remember, there was a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, one of the great college towns of America, and a group of white supremacists and neo-Nazis had a rally in which they carried torches and they said, "Blood and soil and Jews will not replace us." And blood and soil was one of the mottos, actually, of the Nazi Party. And I was seeing this happening, and how could this happen in our country? And candidly, how could the President of the United States say that there were good people on both sides? And I thought this was a moment not to sit on the sidelines. And for better or worse, the president of Harvard is granted a bully pulpit. And I thought this was an opportunity where, I was almost called to do this. Because one of the things that allows events like this to take place, and whether or not it's the Holocaust or it's the genocide in Rwanda, the Cambodian genocide, these things are still happening around the world. And it's imperative, I think, that good people be willing to raise a moral voice in response to injustice. And so this was my opportunity to do it. And during my time at Harvard, I tried to actively try and advocate on behalf of refugees who were trying to come to this country, like my mother. My father was also a refugee coming here. Came before the war. He was born in Minsk. Left to escape the pogroms of Eastern Europe. And so refugees, immigrants, trying to do what I could to keep foreign students in this country when the administration wanted to basically throw them all out during the pandemic. So, I think all of us are products of our experiences, but not just of our own, the experiences in many cases of our ancestors. And those stories stay with us. And I think they do influence what we do and how we do it and why we do it. And if they don't, they should. Whether or not it's one does it, in memory of somebody, whether or not one does it out of respect for the values that have been imparted, but in some cases to do it exactly in response because it's necessary. I think based upon what some of our ancestors may have done to try and work, if you will, to make amends. And so when I read this book, there were many stories in the book. Again, I would really encourage people to read it because I guarantee you will learn a lot about the history of the moment. You will learn a lot about the music of the time, but you will perhaps most importantly learn about the relationship of music to the time in which it was composed, performed, and understood. So I actually want to follow that up, the last comment. I mean, one of the interesting things about music is that it's not experienced in the same way by everybody, and I guess that's true of all art forms. But it's also expressed differently at the time by different performers. When one picks up poetry, I mean, the words don't change on the page. If it's spoken, yes, but otherwise you're reading. If you look at a piece of art, the art itself is likely to be static and not have changed, or at least it shouldn't have, since the day, let's say, a painting was painted. But each performer, each conductor, gives different life to the music that they are performing. Each person who hears it in a context that's sometimes personal. I just gave you an example of how I would listen to music of this. So how is music different in that way from other art forms? You do write about it in the book, and I think it's worth sharing with people and also sharing how it's interpreted differently by different people.
Yes, thank you. The book does, I do talk about this question of how music as an art form is different and some of these really special elective affinities with memory itself, which I'll get to in just a moment. One of the other framing questions that the book explores is what is the difference between how, if I just say the word monument, probably we're all picturing, different built stone, architectural monuments. But there are also, at the heart of this book, is a book about monuments in sound. And how would a monument in stone and a monument in sound, how do they work differently? How do they carry memory differently? How do they carry different memories? And so that's also an interesting question that I invite readers to join me in thinking about. To answer your original question, Larry, I think that it's really fascinating if you think about it, because music is a time-based art that requires an interpreter. There are a kind of it's a whole other set of rules that kind of govern it and frame it. If you think about it, when a composer, let's say in 1823, puts down notes on a page, distilling their own personal worlds of thought and feeling and perhaps something essential about their own society, puts down notes on a page, and then 200 years later, we have a performer right in front of us playing that music, pulling those notes off the page and turning them into this live experience and sound. We are, in a way, literally hearing the past speaking in the present. And so there is this way that I came to understand music as the language of time's non-linearity, its way of kind of flouting the kind of chronologies that history lives with in a kind of lockstep, and in a way that shares exactly these qualities with memory itself, if you think about it, because memory by definition is, you could say, it's musical in the sense that it also challenges the pastness of the past and the objective distance of history. It also brings closer experiences that are quite distant, sometimes by years or decades, and they can feel even more immediate than what we've experienced in just this morning or yesterday. So looking at these similarities between, I have felt that music and memory have really something special and important to say to each other, and looking at each through the prism of the other was one thing that the book tried to do. Yeah.
And again, in thinking about different art forms, which are more similar to music in that sense? Theater, I mean, Shakespeare's been reinterpreted multiple times, almost every time it's presented. But you talk about Guernica.
Yes.
We look at that, and it may move us differently, but it's the same painting that we're all looking at.
Yeah, theater, I think, is a great example. Shakespeare, the poet Federico Garcia Lorca talks about this idea of duende, which is this kind of sort of elusive concept, but it's kind of the sense of art that can channel these distant feelings and these distant events, these distant worlds into a kind of exact present. The critic John Berger has a quote I always have enjoyed, which is that when we listen to a song, we find ourselves inside of a message. And that idea of being inside something is also, for me, also very closely connected to music, because it's such an immersive art form. It literally vibrates inside of us, and that kind of visceral quality, I think, which can also be part of the theater experience, but it can also be special to music.
So, having written this book, will you now listen to other performances of different composers differently? Will you look for the memory that's captured by the composer, or at least what was influencing? Obviously, as a critic, you're always aware of the context in ways that casual listeners are not. But I'm curious, as a critic, how will the experience of writing the book influence the way you understand, appreciate, hear music?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a way, one could almost say it was the other way around, in that the book attempted to try to sort of think through and create a space for a reader to encounter a kind of sensibility in how one relates to music and to art that was very much at the heart of my own experience and my own work as a critic over the years. And so kind of making visible what that approach was part of the goal of writing the book. So I think that I will continue to listen to music as culture's memory, but in a way, the idea is not to suggest that that's the only way we can listen. Of course, it's just one modality of listening, if you will, that the book tries to make available. And circling back to what you were saying, Larry, about your journey being so deeply informed by your mother's example and by that period. I do think that, for those of us who perhaps did not grow up with such a direct family connection to those times, it is this question of, well, then how do we go beyond, the information about that era? How do we really internalize something, a more deeper connection? And that's also what I think I'll be continuing to listen for, the ways in which these works of art, every memorial, you could say, makes a choice about what we carry forward into the future, and what we carry forward can be built upon. So in a sense, every memorial also, while looking back, looks forward. And they also, I think, remind us, this is circling back to your comment about the kind of purpose that your own relationship to the era brought to your career journey. I think these works of art can remind us in general about all of these different values in the past that cannot be taken for granted, and that sort of have to be chosen and affirmed by a society at every turn. And I guess I'm thinking about how these works of music, I believe, can play a much broader sense both in our individual lives and in our life as a society than we're often used to thinking of them as playing.
So as scholars, when we pursue a line of inquiry, when we do our research, there are always moments in which our preconception of things, our hypotheses, we find these nuggets that sort of surprise us. And it may ask us to think hard about what we previously thought. What were the surprises in doing the research for this book? What were those moments when you, wow, I never thought about that, or this is a new way of thinking about something, or I didn't have it right before and now I understand it?
One of the surprises for me in researching the book was definitely realizing how the ways in which memory itself has a history, that the way the story of the war was told has shifted really dramatically over time, and that one of the themes is also that regarding the Holocaust, that every country forgot the Holocaust differently in that early post-war era, and each according to its own post-war needs. It's hard to even remember sometimes because many of us live in almost a kind of memory-saturated environment, with a kind of, films like Schindler's List and others that kind of make us feel as if this is already an era of the past that we know and have dealt with as a society. But in those early years of history that I was researching, the history of the early years of the post-war period, Elie Wiesel could not find a publisher for Night. I think that he tried over 15 before he was successful. Primo Levi's works that are so iconic and respected today could not find an audience. And one of the pieces I write about, which is called The Survivor from Warsaw, the first major musical memorial to the Holocaust, even though it was commissioned right here in Boston, right down the road at the Kusevitsky Music Foundation, and would have typically been premiered by the Boston Symphony, when the score came in, because it dealt so baldly with this kind of wrenching and in some ways completely unassimilable tragedy that had just happened, Kusevitsky did not want to touch it. And so the work its world premiere ended up happening in a university gymnasium, 1948, a university gymnasium in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with amateur forces in the orchestra and cowboys singing in the chorus. So these kind of surreal moments, that was one incredible surprise to me, and it just makes you realize that these works are amazing unto themselves, but they're also these keyholes that we can sort of look through onto these much vaster and, for me, really fascinating vistas of culture and history and memory.
We're almost out of time. My doctoral dissertation advisor said to me, "You never finish a dissertation, you just stop writing it." And I suspect that's the case here, that there's a lot more to be said. And I speak for, I think, all of those of us who've had the opportunity to read your book, that we look forward to what follows. Again, thank you, Jeremy, for an absolutely terrific conversation about an even better book.
Thank you, Larry, so much. Yeah, thank you.